Giadiva Harja, agus Fáilte Arash go Irish with Róise. Today is finally time for part 2 of Irish future tense verbs. Last time when we talked about the future tense, we talked about a certain category of verbs called first conjugation verbs. But today we're going to talk about second conjugation verbs. Personally, I think second conjugation verbs are a little bit easier and more straightforward to conjugate in the future tense than first conjugation verbs. And I think they're fun to say. So, what are we waiting for? Come on! Okay, before we officially start, I will say that I will be pronouncing most of these verbs in the Dono Olster way, or at least my best attempt at the Dono Olster way. Obviously, I'm not a native speaker, but I have been studying very hard. But I also will be going over some of the other varying pronunciations throughout Ireland from what I've learned. First, let's review what verbs are and how they work in Irish. As you can see, as usual, I have my notes on the other side of the screen and you can follow along if you want. Also, at the end of the video, if you'd like to keep these notes, you can download them via Dropbox, and they'll also be on Facebook and Instagram. And I'll put the link below. Alright, let's read the first black box at the top. Verbs are words that express action or a state of being. For example, run, jump, feel, or be. In Irish, a verb must usually be changed before it can be used. So, for example, we have the verb ahrish, which means to recite. This is the form of the verb that you would see listed in a dictionary. This is called the verb root. But to be able to actually functionally use this verb, like other verbs, we'll need to change it in some way to a different form to use it. So below that you can see ahrishahay, which means will recite, future tense of to recite. Note that a suffix eoidh was added. Again, in a couple of minutes, I'll be going over the various pronunciations throughout Ireland of this future tense suffix. But for now, just remember I'll be using the Dono Olster variation of that. Let's read below that. Sometimes the root must change to a stem before a suffix is added. You may remember this flower illustration from part 1 of future tense Irish verbs that I used to illustrate the process of changing the root to the final form. Now, the dictionary form again is called the root. Not always, but most of the time, that will need to change into a verb stem. The stem is an unusable, non-functional version of the verb. We just need to change the root a little bit before we add the suffix. I will be explaining and covering later how you yourself can automatically know how to convert any root of a second conjugation verb into a stem, depending on what subcategory of verb it is. But just for example, we have the verb séimhiú, which means to seal. That's the verb root. We'll need to change it into its stem form before we can add any kind of tense-related suffix to it. Now in this case, the stem of séimhiú is shale. Once we add our suffix, you can see in the final version in the flower part of the illustration, we have séilehai, will seal, the future tense of to seal. Now on this next page, we'll cover some of the various pronunciations of that future tense second conjugation ending o fada idh or eo idh, keeping in mind that both of those suffixes are always pronounced the same as each other. Now the pronunciation may vary by dialect and region, but they'll always be pronounced the same as each other. So at the top of the page, the suffix added for many verbs in the future tense is o fada idh or eoidh, as we just said. In the black box, I have, this is pronounced differently in each dialect. Here is a guide, a general guide, for the pronunciations of those endings. Now the Ulster pronunciation. This is the one I'm most familiar with because I focus my pronunciation studies on the Ulster dialect, specifically Donegal, which is the Gaeltacht of the Ulster region. So, in Ulster, this is pronounced either a hi or a he. Now, let me put a asterisk on that. technically, with my own ears, I have never heard a native speaker pronounce this ending a he. But I have read on websites and in books that gave a written out description of the pronunciation saying that this ending is pronounced a he. So just because I haven't personally heard it doesn't mean that it's wrong and that some people don't do that. I just haven't heard it. I've always heard it pronounced a hi. And actually right now I'm going to pop in a short screen recording of an audio file from fuamana.ie of a native Donegal speaker pronouncing the future tense of to buy, will buy, ceannahai.
Ceannahai. Ceannahai.
Now you can see she clearly said ceannahai. I've also listened to many literal hours and hours and hours of native Donegal speakers speaking on RTE's Radio na Gaeltarta, as well as other various online resources, including almost every video available from the YouTube channel of Arklan Guidoi, which is the theater company in Gweedore, as well as many of the audio files from the website Gaeilge.ie. And consistently, this ending seems to always be pronounced a hi, except for before personal pronouns sometimes, but I'll get to that in a second. By the way, all those resources I just listed are great resources for listening to speakers in the Ulster dialect, as well as 3 really great books I have that come with audio CDs that have native Donegal speakers narrating the stories, and I will list all those resources, including those 3 books, down below in the description if you're interested in the Donegal dialect. But anyway, below that you can see that before personal pronouns, this ending in Ulster will be pronounced a huh. Now, I will say I have heard, it's kind of like a thing you have to feel out, I think. It's often pronounced a huh, but I've heard some speakers still say a hi before personal pronouns, but I would say, from what I've heard, more often than not, it's a huh. Now, a personal pronoun is a word like I, you, we, he, she, they. So if you were to say Anya will buy, you would say ceannahai Anya. But if you were to say she will buy, it would be more like ceannahai she. Now, below that, you'll see in the northern area of the Connacht dialect, which would be around Mayo, this ending would be pronounced more like oi. Now, I haven't personally heard this, but it's not because they're not saying that. It's just that I don't intensely pay attention to the pronunciation of most of the other dialects besides Ulster, because I'm really focused on the Ulster dialect when it comes to pronunciation. But I have read this from people who are far more qualified than me online, affirm that this is true. So this is what I'm presenting to you from what I know. So in Northern Connacht, this ending would be pronounced oi, but before personal pronouns, more like o. So for example, if you were to say Anya will buy, it would sound like ceannoi Anya, but she will buy would sound like ceanno she. Now, in the southern part of the Connacht Gaeltart, I'm trying to learn to say Gaeltart instead of Gaeltacht, because again, that's a Donegal Irish thing. ACHT is more like art instead of act. Drilling it into myself. Anyway, in South Connacht, around the Galway area, this ending will be pronounced o always. So for example, Anya will buy. Well, in Connacht and Munster, they would say the name Anya more like Anya, so I'll honor that. Okay, so Anya will buy, ceanno Anya. She will buy, ceanno she. Last but not least, in the Munster dialect in the very south of Ireland, this ending will be pronounced oig. Notice the stress is on the first part of that ending, oig, if it's before most nouns. But before personal pronouns, it'll be O, but the stress will still be on the O part overall in the verb. I'll show you what I mean. So, Anya will buy Kianoig Anya. She will buy Kianoshi. Kianoshi. The stress is on the last part. So now you know. Now, I will say there's another way, a fourth way, that I know of to pronounce this ending. And I, of all people, wouldn't call this incorrect. But keep in mind that technically, as far as I've read, seen, and heard, this pronunciation doesn't exist among native speakers within any of the Gaeltacht areas. I think this pronunciation may have roots in what I believe is called the Lerchanúch, which means like the central or middle dialect, which was an attempt by some guy, I don't remember his name, but I think it might have been in the 80s, an attempt by him to standardize the Irish pronunciations of words, I think for the purposes of education in schools. And I don't think it really worked out as well as he hoped, because from what I read, it didn't really take. But some of it did, and I think this fourth pronunciation might be a result of that. But anyway, the ending in this case would be pronounced more like Oe, Oe, which to me sounds like a really interesting combination between the Munster dialect, where the emphasis is on the first of those two syllables, Oe, and maybe like the Mayo North Connaught dialect with the ending E. So that's pretty interesting. But anyway, that's what I know on the subject of that fourth pronunciation. But if any of y'all have any more insight, please share it with me, because I love learning. Educate me down below. Now we'll move on to the next page. On the next page, you'll see sometimes when conjugating, we'll need to distinguish between broad and slender verbs. A broad verb is a verb whose final vowel in its stem is A, O, or U. So let's look at an example. We've got the verb cowrie, which means to help. That's the verb root. Now again, I'm not going to explain yet how to form a stem in each case, but in this case, the stem is C-A-B-H-R. Now, A is the final, and in this case, the only vowel in the stem, which is a broad vowel. So the verdict is that this is a broad verb. Below that, we see that a slender verb is a verb whose final vowel in its stem is E or I. So, for example, we have the verb falshi. That's the verb root, and it means to publish or reveal. The stem in this case is F-O-I-L-S. So, the final vowel in that stem is an I, which is a slender vowel. Therefore, this is a slender verb. That's the verdict. Now, we're going to see in a minute why it's so important to be able to distinguish between a broad verb and a slender verb, because it'll help us choose between those two endings, O fada IDH or EO IDH. Okay, starting to lose my voice. Had to get some sweet tea. Love me some Milos. Family made since 1946 in Bessemer, Alabama. That's not their jingle, but it should be. Alright, so moving on. There are two main categories of Irish verbs. Today, we're going to look at the second conjugation verbs. As you know, these take the suffix O fada IDH or EO IDH, depending on the broadness or slenderness of the stem. Here are the types of verbs that make up those second conjugation verbs. There are three main categories, but the thing to remember in general is that, generally speaking, almost all two-syllable verbs will be second conjugation verbs. So the first subcategory of the second conjugation verbs are two-syllable verbs that end in A-I-G-H or I-G-H. For example, sulshi, which means to shine, or dausi, which means to dance. The second subcategory are two-syllable verbs ending in a consonant. For example, osco, to open. The last subcategory is a pretty small subcategory, and it's a random handful of two-syllable verbs that basically you just have to memorize, that end in a consonant, that are either not changed at all from root to stem, or that are irregularly changed. Two examples of this category of verb would be folum, which means to learn, or taisce, which means to travel. First, let's look at the first subcategory of those second conjugation verbs. So, these will be the two-syllable verbs ending with aigh or igh. For example, dousey, to dance. We will drop the aigh or igh to form the stem. So, for example, with dousey, you'll drop the aigh and you're just left with damhs, and that's the stem. To form the future tense, we'll add o fada idh if the stem is broad, or eoidh if the stem is slender. So I have two more examples underneath. We've got kiani, to buy, kiana hai una will buy. The stem, ceann, is broad, therefore it's a broad verb, because the last vowel in the stem is an A, which is a broad vowel. So we'll add O fada idh, and it's kiana hai una. Under that we have sulshi, again, to shine. It's a slender verb because the last vowel in the stem is an I, so we'll add eoidh, sulshahasha. It will shine, or he will shine. The next subcategory are two-syllable verbs ending with a consonant. For example, osko, to open. These verbs are interesting because the roots are collapsed or syncopated by removing the vowels between the last two consonants to form the stem. For example, again, osko. So remove the A and the I, which are the vowels between the last two consonants in the root. We're left with oscl. That's the stem that we'll add the ending to. Below that you'll see that again we'll add O fada idh if the stem is broad, or eoidh if the stem is slender. So for example, tahol, to dig. So we'll syncopate this verb by removing the vowels between the last two consonants of the verb root. We're left with tochl. The last and only vowel in that stem is an O, which is broad, so it's a broad verb. So we choose O fada idh, and we're left with tachlahama, I will dig. Below that we have the verb inish, to tell. We'll syncopate this root into a stem by removing the I between the N and the S. We're left with ins. The last and only vowel in this stem is an I, a slender vowel, therefore it's a slender verb. We'll add eoidh, and we're left with inshahai and van, the woman will tell. Now, our last category of verbs is similar to the category we just talked about, but it has a twist. So you can see a few verbs tend to resist syncopation. Here's my updated version of the syncopation resistance man. He's like fighting the power or something. These verbs will resist being syncopated or collapsed to form their stem, and you kind of just have to memorize them. So we have frastal, to attend. Its stem is frastal. It changes very slightly, only the I is lost between the T and the L, the last two consonants. Under that we have taisce, to travel. It's actually so resistant that it gains girth, and more letters are added. So the I between the T and the L is replaced in the stem by an EA. Taisce, taisce. Now, under that we have ahrish, to recite. The stem is equal to the root, ahrish. Taring, it's the exact same in the stem. In Ulster, though, I've heard some people pronounce this verb tarin as though it doesn't have a G at the end. Fun fact. Under that we have turling, to descend. The stem is the same. Under that we have fulling, to endure. Stem is the same. And then last, folum, to learn. The stem is the same. So as you can see, no change is made to these verbs from root to stem except for frastal and taisce. So, still talking about the same subcategory of verbs. Once you have the usually unchanged stem for these syncopation resistant verbs, you can then choose either the broad ending or the slender ending. So for example, again, taisce, to travel. Once you form the stem, it's a broad verb, so o fada idh. Taisce in the Dalti. The students will travel. Folum, to learn. Well, it doesn't change from root to stem, so the last vowel is an I, a slender vowel, so we choose E-O-I-D-H. Folum. That's a mouthful. Alright, we're on the home stretch, y'all. Okay, so questions in Irish in the future tense will trigger aru when possible. For example, Cludahatu, you will cover. But, Gludahatu, will you cover? As you can see, a G was added in front of the C. I have a video about what aru or eclipsis is in Irish, which is what you see happening there with adding a G before the C. I'll link it down below and you can watch that. I won't re-explain it here, but for those of you who already know, that's what's happening here. On the other hand, negative statements will trigger Séimhiú or Lenition when possible. So for example, Mashahama, I will decorate. But Ni Washahama, I won't decorate. Ni is the negative particle or statement that we add in front of the verb in this case, and it triggers lenition or Séimhiú. Again, I won't re-explain that here, but I'll link below my previous videos explaining what that is. But as you can see, we added an H after the M, and it changed the M sound to a W sound in this case. Under that, you can see that negative questions will trigger aru or eclipsis when possible. For example, Dausahashi, she will dance. But won't she dance would be Nachnausahashi. Again, we added an additional letter before the first consonant of that verb, an N in this case, because N is the buddy letter of D. Again, if you want to know more about how that works, I'll link my previous video on eclipsis or aru in the description below. Now it's time for bonus facts. The first fact is that some speakers will combine the verb and the pronoun mudge, which means we. Now, before I go on, as far as I know, native speakers in Ulster for sure, and I think in Connacht generally, will not combine the verb and the pronoun. I think it's mostly Munster speakers that do that. So because of that, I'll be pronouncing these example verbs in the Munster dialect because I think that would better showcase the difference in the ways to do it. So, for example, while some may say Raunomudge, we will choose, others say Raunomidge. Now basically the main detectable difference in the sound of those two, I would say, is in the broadness and slenderness of the M in mudge. So Raunomudge, broad M, m. But a slender M, m. Raunomudge, Raunomidge. So here are two other examples. We will fly. Etlomudge or Etlomidge. We will shine. Solshomudge or Solshomidge. Not much of a difference audibly, but you can see that there is a difference in how you would spell it. The combined version of the verb and the pronoun, the personal pronoun, is called synthetic form, I believe. Now, the second bonus fact is that you may remember from the previous installment of these notes on future tense Irish verbs, first conjugation, that there are some two-syllable Irish verbs that are actually first conjugation verbs. These are all verbs that have an accent mark or a fada in the second syllable. For example, sawal, to save, or chumwan, to drive. So be sure to take note of that. Well, shin shin for now, Harja. Thank you again for watching my video, and if you'd like to keep these notes, again, you can find the links for that down below. And if you liked this video, please give me a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more. And you can also follow me on my Instagram, which I'll link down below. But until next time, Slán go fóill.